What's up, everyone? It's the Autistic Scyther here, and this is part 5 of my essay of every Fire Emblem character that I believe are either autistic, whether possibly confirmed autistic, or autistic coded. And basically, considering the previous parts have mentioned the modern Fire Emblem titles, yeah, this one takes place with the more classic titles that many of us know of, specifically the GBA Fire Emblem titles. And considering this is part 5, and the previous 4 parts are up, I suggest you watch those 4 parts, and then come back to this video, for the big finale. So, without further ado, let's get back into it. Alright, for those that already don't know, many of us here in the West were introduced to Fire Emblem, through Super Smash Bros. Melee. But when it comes to Fire Emblem as a franchise from its games as a whole, we were introduced to Fire Emblem Blazing Sword for the GBA. And as such, we were introduced to a lot of different characters, and many of them basically became popular for many different reasons. Lyn, considering all the many Lyn simps there are out there, and the amount of ults that she's gotten, really has either helped or hurt, depending on who you ask. Hector, for the sheer brokenness that he brings, giving him the name of Hector the Rector. Sarah became infamous for how annoying she can be. Doesn't mean I don't like her, though. Seriously, I really like Sarah. And Nino, just for being the most adorable little cinnamon roll in the game, before Annette shows up. Seriously, considering what she's been through, she deserves a hug and a Happy Meal. However, one character that comes to mind that most people don't think of is Canas. And surprisingly enough, if you remember from my first video, I mentioned that Lute is the one that most people think of when they think of autistic Fire Emblem characters. And in fairness, that one is true. But technically, there's a good chance that the first one many of us have experienced as being autistic is Canas. That proof is very subtle. Since when he shows up, he just shows up to help you out through a Gaiden chapter. And that's if you can keep the green units alive. Which, considering how they rush into situations, that's not gonna happen for the longest time. That being said, honestly, in all fairness, Canas is more or less known for having a love of studying. Specifically studying the dark arts, or as he calls it, elder magic. Namely because this has been within his family, as not only has his mother, Neem, essentially, he dabbled in mastered the dark arts herself, but also his 2 other brothers have studied dark magic and received some very horrifying side effects. That being said, in fairness, what really does say a lot is, kind of simple. Canas basically more or less takes his studying of dark magic as a bit of an autistic special interest, and takes it even further as he takes gathering knowledge and reading to an extreme as an autistic special interest as well, and takes it to an interesting level that we wouldn't see until Miriel in Fire Emblem Awakening. To the point that in many of his supports, he's basically just always seen reading a book. And more often than not, it tends to be a little, well, dare I say, a heartwarming or kind of ending up in a good reaction when you think about it, as he and Pent basically not only bond over books and magic and learning about different forms of magic, especially once he realized that even Pent's a big fan of Kanas's mother. But even in Nino's entire support, which is one of the most heartwarming supports, he even takes the time to teach her how to read. To the point that we learn that Nino may very well be related to Kanas through her mother being Kanas's wife's sister. Which honestly really does say a lot, considering for anyone who remembers what Nino's story is all about. But then, more often than not, it tends to be an issue for most of the people that he's supporting with, as Veda basically will take the chance to more or less bully and belittle Kanas for just reading on the battlefield, even taking his books and feeding him to her wyvern, which is messed up to say the least. But then there's Barter, who honestly wonders how you could hurt someone with just a normal book if you're not firing magic from it. And this is a guy who probably doesn't know how to spell the word book, which really does say a lot. However, in my actual research and analysis of all of this led me to a very surprising character that I wasn't sure would be full on consider this, but it was Kanas's son, Hugh. Yeah. Just like when you consider that Miriel and Owain may have passed on their possible autistic traits to their offspring, being Laurent and Ophelia. Yeah. Same thing can be said for Kanas. And naturally, Hugh doesn't look to have the traits of anyone on the autistic spectrum, as he just seems to be a guy who just cares more about getting the bag, if you know what I mean, as in cha-ching. But that being said, he more or less has a bit of a naivete where he tends to get tricked more often than not by anyone just because they ask. And honestly, for those who already don't know, oh boy, this is something that many people on the autism spectrum tend to really struggle with, as more often than not, anyone who tends to show a bit of kindness to them or tends to be nice, they tend to think of them as friends, or even if it's a romantic interest, they tend to think that it's just love when obvious things that are considered abusive as just love, which honestly really does say a lot. However, in this case, this one just tends to be the whole thing with friendship or camaraderie. And surprisingly enough, we get to see this in spades with Hugh's supports, as basically we get not just one, but not two, but three supports involving Hugh basically having a Nosferatu tome from his grandmother Neem stolen from him after he lent it out, and his efforts of trying to get it back. As in this case, it's basically his supports with Lou, his grandmother Neem, and Ray, who is the one who basically tricked him into giving him the Nosferatu tomes as an effort to borrow him, and basically never gave it back. And in all fairness, there is a personal thing here, as this happened with me, as I had I loaned a lot of my Game Boy video games to someone I thought was a friend, and when I let them borrow it, and I tried to get them back, but I had a hard time of doing so, which really does say a lot. Granted, it took place when I was a kid, but yeah. And heck, he even has a support with Cass, basically involving money. And granted, considering Cass thinks that he just stole it, yeah, he really basically proves that he didn't steal it. So it's mostly just, I mean, sure, he's just taunting her about this, but granted, yeah, Cass ends up stealing it from him, his money from him, without even knowing by the end of the A support, which really does say a lot. That being said, this just leads us into the final character that could be considered autistic. As from the very first playable brigand that we have ever played, and ever played since, in Binding Blade, Gonzalez. And for those of you, if anyone has ever read the book Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, they know about one of the characters, Lenny, about how his childlike demeanor and trusting nature has more often than not caused people to take advantage of him throughout the book, to the point that at the end, his buddy George has to tearfully end Lenny because of all of this. Oh boy. Yeah, Gonzalez is basically similar. Well, it's been mentioned that Lenny may also be a representation of the autism spectrum. And the same thing here applies with Gonzalez. Granted, while the guy is ugly as sin, he is basically more or less working for one of the bosses in Fire Emblem Binding Blade Skullin as kind of I'd say a henchman, where he sends him out to destroy a village in the Western Isles. And yeah, he more or less does so where he tries to find a way, because he's trying to find a way to fit in, because he believes nobody likes him. And it takes interacting with Lilina and Lilina to show kindness to him, for him to basically just, join their group. And it's the entire support with Lilina that basically shows his kind nature throughout everything. And it's one of the most heartwarming supports. Granted, there are other supports, but yeah, for anyone who knows about this, it's the Leland Gonzalez support that basically proves it. It really does say a lot. So with that, those are all of the Fire Emblem characters that I believe are autistic or autistic coded. Thank you for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you next time!